So what do you do to relax?
Look for trouble. Society is breeding a new kind of criminal.
Captain, look, I don't want to be a hero. I just want to get involved, all right?
It's also breeding a new kind of cop.
You're a disease, and I'm the cure.
Stallone is Cobra. Rated R. Opens Memorial Day weekend.
Searching my past for the things that I've seen. Is it my life or just something I dream?
Résumé. Now. 1. A summing up, summary. 2. A brief written account of personal, educational, and professional qualifications and experiences. May is an odd month because Mike's Amazing World of Comics has books listed as shipping on the 1st, the 6th, and the 8th. April was already a long 5-week month, so maybe if I double up on a few titles this month, I figure it's still better for the added weight to go here rather than there. So for the purpose of clarity, I'll just treat all those dates as representative of the first week of the month. Greetings, gills and ghouls. It's time again for the hostess with the mostest in Elvira's House of Mystery number 6. Under another great Mark Beecham cover with a fairly solid likeness that enthusiastically incorporates Elvira's plunging neckline is a slightly frustrating conceit. This issue is meant to be read sideways, spine up. On the plus side, that means nearly twice as much story this issue. On the downside, each page features 2 standard story pages, squished to fit within a big gap in the middle, and it's pretty good art getting done this disservice. Tom Greinberg and Jim Fern mined Elvira's assets in the introduction that segues into the yarn, A New York Yankee in King Arthur's Court with the beer bombs. It's clear Tom and Mary are fans, and produced this one specifically for this magazine, because Elvira continues to break in throughout the tale to narrate and quip. Greinberg is very much in Neil Adams mode as a baseball player wrestling with medieval times, and Elvira's dress wrestles with her curvy figure. Next is Subject for Postmortem, by Robert Kanigher and George Freeman, where a grave-robbing physician ends up on the wrong end of the scalpel. Two-Edged Sword, by Elizabeth M. Smith, Charles Nicholas, and Joe Giella, comes across a bit ho-or-y, especially when the last panel offers an Elvira that looks more like the Mark Beecham interstitial pages, and could easily have been a Kane corner instead. Heck, there's even a painting of Kane on the next panel following, as if nodding to a paste-in. The conquistadors of Kanigher and Yes Yodleman's You'll Beg to Die meet a grisly fate in another Adams-indebted piece, though this one with additional Filipino flair. Again, the pasted-in Beecham Elvira in the last panel gives up the game of this being a converted inventory story from some previously cancelled horror anthology. There's no room for contrivance in Joey Cavalieri and Rick Estrada's Just Like Clockwork, which looks like it was drawn in the same time as the Kubrick flick they're referencing. The style and fashions would have been outdated a decade earlier, so I have to assume Cavalieri just scripted pages that had never made it to the lettering stage. But just so you don't forget who's running this show, Beecham comes back for more va-va-va-voom pinup. Hopefully someday any rights issues can be untangled to reprint his pages in proper scale, while Elvira's still around to sign it. Oh, and her fan club springs for an ad, offering an autographed 8x10, bumper sticker, and more for just $6.50 plus postage. The high contrast Xerox photos only add to the resemblance in the Greinberg and Beecham pages. The next issue had 4 pages of new interstitials to make up for the rest obviously being repurposed inventory for one of the Act's science fiction anthologies, and even with a Bill Sienkiewicz cover, I couldn't see my way to supporting that one. My half-brother splurged on the double-sized, $1.25 G.I. Joe A Real American Hero number 50. The Rod Wiggum-drawn lead story was the Battle of Springfield, bringing to a head a long simmering subplot about an entire suburb having been taken over by Cobra infiltrators. This one was packed with memorable moments, like the spies burning documents in the fireplace as tanks roll down Main Street, or a dad preparing to shoot the family dog in front of his kids before evacuating. Serpentor was still cool at this point, topless in jeans adorned only by the King Cobra cowl and cape. He lustily plunges into the fray, and when shot, cauterized the wound with a heated knife. Storm Shadow is resurrected in a chemical vat, and is none too happy about it. Then there's a preview story for the upcoming spin-off G.I. Joe Special Missions, with returning original artist Herb Trimpe. He was previously assimilated by Bob McLeod, but here he inks himself, taking a cue from Tony Salmons and Kyle Baker with a loose, sketchier, more contemporary style. This one has a lot of grit, with the Joes facing airplane hijackers, without shying away from the violence of such a terroristic act. I think this was the first story I ever encountered to feature tasers. Good stuff. To my mind, a cover with a mass of heroes carrying the massive form of an unconscious Hulk is a lot more memorable than another brawl. But as it happens, The Incredible Hulk number 322 is mostly an exceptionally brutal slugfest. It fulfills the promise of recent lackluster issues, even if I'll never get used to Del Barras embellishing Al Milgrom. I don't think Marvel Age was ever on the newsstand, but my half-brother had access to a comic shop, and would sometimes pick it up for a pair of quarters. Number 41 offered a frenetic cover of Stan Lee, but was otherwise a lackluster issue. I did get use out of The Marvel Age, a serialized text feature on Marvel Comics history that filled in the gap between Marvel Saga and my 80s purchases. This month covering 1972 in first installment. The Marvel Saga, the official history of the Marvel Universe number 9, downgrades the new Angel origin story pages from Sienkiewicz to Steve Geiger, which is not helpful. The Keith Pollard cover offering the initial Spider-Man Dr. Octopus battle doesn't much salve that wound. There's also a lot of Vulture, Kree, and Red Ghost material here. The book is moving closer to a capsule index over the more narrative synopses of previous issues, so Puppet Master and Radioactive Man only rate a panel each. The Wasp gets a few pages, but it's hard not to notice the disproportionate space afforded Spider-Man stories involving losers like the Tinkerer. Sometimes it feels like the book wants to be Marvel Tales instead of Marvel Saga. And now, a brief review of my history with Keith Giffen to date. I had one of the Flash issues with a Giffen Dr. Fate backup, from when he still drew a little like George Perez. Did his 2-page Legion of Superheroes advertainment piece for the first 1983 DC sampler. I was also drawn to house ads for the Omega Men and the Baxter format Legion relaunch, though between the two, Giffen's style had changed so much as to be nigh unrecognizable from one to the other. Sometime around 1983, Giffen was exposed to the Argentine artist Jose Munoz, known for a loose, high-contrast style, somewhat like what Steranko had used on Chandler and Miller would use on Sin City. This exposure effectively broke and rebuilt Giffen, who locked himself in a room for days, just studying every panel of Munoz. Afterwards, his approach to art was forever changed, to the point where outlets like the Comics Journal accused Giffen of plagiarism, but he always swore that he never had a Munoz page on his table when he was drawing. You know how Brad Pitt used to adopt the fashion style of every woman that he was in a relationship with? Giffen was like that with artists, beginning with Jack Kirby, and going through periods of heavy Kevin Maguire, Bart Sears, and Simon Bisley influence after having worked with them. Munoz, though, was never a commercial success in the West, and between the critics calling him a swiper, and the fanboys detesting how Munoz applied to superheroes, Giffen had committed career suicide. He went from a fan favorite to a pariah almost overnight. The one project that he was able to hold on to and experience some modest success with was his humor character, Ambush Bug, featured in a string of Superman comics and a solo miniseries. I missed all that stuff. I came in on the second issue of the follow-up miniseries, Son of Ambush Bug. Now, I believe my interest was piqued by the first issue's cover, in which Ambush Bug is essentially buried in sensationalistic cover blurbs. Yet I did not pick it up. Rereading it today, it might have been the extended manga parody starring the Japanese Ambush Bug battling a kaiju. Maybe I just wanted some other comic more and missed my shot, but I did buy the second issue, with an almost entirely red cover depicting Ambush Bug at the gates of literal hell. Let me tell you, I went back and I bought the first miniseries in 1987, and most of the other stuff in 1989. The Ambush Bug stocking stuffer was one of many swell holiday parodies by the Jewish creator. The pre-1986 Bug material remains some of the most hilarious Western superhero comics ever created. But Son of Ambush Bug is not funny. In retrospect, it's about the depression, regret, and paranoia surrounding what Giffen probably felt was his second and final self-sabotaging of his artistic career, assuming he'd end up backselling vacuums or working at a chemical plant. Whether another example of slitting his wrists, or more likely, an editorial mandate from the new DC wanting to be taken with the utmost seriousness in the post-crisis landscape, the miniseries was denied access to, basically, the entire DC universe. There are references to named villains represented as in-story hand puppets, with Swamp Thing portrayed as a potted houseplant, and Superman's discarded boot makes appearances. Otherwise, a book that by design was an anarchic take on DC properties had to create everything from whole cloth, at a time when Giffen was at a creative nadir, and he had no other choice but to carry on with his only viable project. Looking at it today, this book is bizarre, extremely dark, repetitive, derivative, and needlessly cruel in its humor. I was utterly fascinated with it. I'd been around comics for my entire life, actively collecting for several years, and I'd never seen anything like it. The grotesquely realistic citizens populating a filthy, grimy, sticky, sweaty urban hellscape, contrasted against a lanky, lime green loser trapped in a bug suit, whining about his life, and devoted to a Cabbage Patch doll dressed as his sidekick. Except it's a comic book. So I can't tell that Cheeks the Toy Wonder isn't a small, mute, blankly staring, and largely inanimate child. You've got all these ugly weirdos talking to who? I can't tell. Their feet? The blues are coming from their feet. What are they even talking about? A plot to murder Ambush Bug, who's already so lost and worthless? Why go through the trouble? But they do. Not once, or twice, but 5 times, at some length. And once is a mirror image of the first time. but with gobbledygook dialogue. When Bug does go to the Infernal, it's a Gilliam-esque bureaucratic nightmare, and he's led there by his guardian angel, who's a haggard old abusive drunk who openly hates his charge. And the Cabbage Patch Doll is in his own short war story that's probably my first comic with homosexual subtext. But also it's full of intense close-ups, near-abstract images largely divorced from the context of the narrative, and though there are a number of splash pages, most story pages have a minimum of 9 panels, with many closer to 12 to 13. Hey, here's 8 random panels of ways to die in outer space. Here's a couple of moronic secret agents, one speaking in a Father Guido Sarducci Italian accent, looking at scraps of a costume under a microscope for over 19 panels across 2 pages. There's a multi-page sequence about talking animated socks. It was so obtuse, so creepy and gross and indecipherable. It was my first exposure to David Lynch, except it was Keith Giffen, and I needed more. Superman number 422 had a glorious monochrome Brian Bolland cover of Kal-El transforming into some sort of weird thing, but only his blood-red eyes colored. Too bad the interiors were Kurt Swan, who even buried under heavy dark inks, took the lead right out of my pencil. This one haunted the Marauder Books quarter bin, thwarted by those limp interiors. Uncanny X-Men number 208 was another read at my brother's place, but I can't recall if we were still at my father's apartment or if he'd moved into a house by then. This should be the last issue released during my collecting years read out of sequence, backfilling details for the next issue that I read new. It's pretty rich having mass murderer Logan try to validate stabbing Phoenix to prevent her from killing the Black Queen, an energy vampire whose continued existence is predicated on draining humans of life. Captain America's feet are far more firmly planted on moral high ground. Even he was okay with decapitation in that specific circumstance. It also means the Hellfire Club will be at full strength while seeking reprisals, although the Super Sentinel Nimrod will prove more effective and debilitating than the club.
So come on, baby, won't you show some class? Why you wanna move so fast? We don't have to take our clothes off to have a good time. Oh no, we could dance and party all night, dance all night, and drink some cherry wine. We don't have to take our clothes off, no, to have a good time. Oh no. We could dance and party all night, cherry wine. Na 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 na
Unsurprisingly, not a lot of TV during the summer months. I think I caught some reruns of You Again, a show where Jack Klugman played the estranged father of John Stamos, who comes to live with him. Mary Tyler Moore briefly returned to television on a tabloid sitcom that also featured John Astin, Katie Seagal, and James Tolkien, but got axed after 13 episodes. I think my mom was still following the TV show Dallas, but even if she wasn't, it made national news in the same way the question who shot JR crossed lips a few years earlier. The attempted murder of the dastardly J.R. Ewing was a resounding moment for television, in a way that other shows modeled or good-naturedly parodied. The supposed death of his brother Bobby was a whole other matter. Bobby Ewing had been hit by a car, dying in his wife's arms, completely altering the course of the series. Or it would have, if said wife, Pam, hadn't woken up to find her very much alive husband stepping out of the shower, revealing that the entire prior season had been a dream. This would also become the stuff of legend, as in legendary failure. While not the firmly established example of the Fonz jumping over a shark while water skiing on an episode of Happy Days, a reference to Bobby in the shower inspires derision for shows that have become creatively bankrupt and abusive towards its audience. Dallas became a laughingstock, and never recovered from the corner it had painted itself into. My mother was, of course, watching Patrick Swayze, Leslie Ann Down, and Kirstie Alley in the miniseries North and South Book 2, Love and War, but it didn't hold my interest. Also, NBC adopted their most iconic peacock logo that month. The peacock dated back to the mid-50s, and was revised in 1979 with 11 feathers, 5 matching on each side. It was in 1986 that they simplified the peacock to 6 individual colors that indicate the bird in silhouette. They've given it digital textures and tones, sometimes with or without the letters NBC, but the core peacock design has remained unchanged for nearly 40 years.
I'm mad about you. You're mad about me, babe. A couple of fools run wild. I dream. Mad about you. Lost in your eyes. Mad about love. Mad about you. You and I.
As I've probably mentioned in the past, but just to recap, I managed to evade John Byrne's Fantastic Four better than most of my generation. I remember seeing the Diablo cover with the FF as candlesticks and thinking that looked cool. I think I tossed through the triple-sized 20th anniversary issue. I believe the Sideways issue was at a barber shop that I went to. And the same may have been true of the Mask of Doom photo cover. I of course got the She-Hulk Pap topless issue, and one of the Dark Sue Malice issues. Ultimately though, I preferred She-Hulk as an Avenger, and I bought more Things solo comics than FF ones, at least up to this point. I think I got Fantastic Four number 293 out of a 3-pack with something else I wanted more, but at least there's another She-Hulk cover. Her I liked. Storm, Richard's family, never. Reed was like a pedantic high school science teacher. Sue was like a wallpaper kindergarten teacher, and Johnny felt like a pretty boy bully somewhere in between. I was so invested in the Fantastic Four that I struggled to figure out how it related to the movie Fantastic Voyage. The shrinking one with Raquel Welch, not the Sinbad one. I was ignorant, not an imbecile. The 1967 Hanna-Barbera cartoon ran really early in the morning, and the 1978 one with Herbie was too lame and short-lived to rate much attention from me. As you probably noticed, I was quite the Marvel zombie at this point, but the FF felt like a DC team in the most pejorative sense. You had the one crazy kid in the padded cell screaming that he was Dr. Doom, and then most of the issue was doing science stuff in the desert against a big ink blob. Towards the end, the team got sucked into some future state where the original FF were worshipped as gods, which felt very Mort Weisinger before I knew what that meant. Thor was another one of those old-timey Kirby-type books that did not appeal to me. I tossed through the one with Dracula as a back issue. The Walt Simonson stuff had a great sense of power to it, and I did eye that first Better Ray Bill cover in his continuing adventures. The frog stuff, the one killer spread from a Marvel Age annual where the Asgardians were using conventional assault weapons. Nothing ever sealed the deal though, and quite randomly, I dipped in for a fill-in. I don't recall if I bought the Mighty Thor number 370 on purpose or out of the 3-pack. Quite probably the same one as the Fantastic Four. I wonder what the third book would have been. Maybe an Uncanny X-Men. Anyway, it had a nice inventory pinup cover by Big John Buscema, but the interiors were inked by P. Craig Russell for a very contrasting look. Both Thor and FF had gorgeous John Workman lettering, which couldn't have hurt. The story was a western titled Easy Money, and was written by Jim Owsley, the future Christopher Priest. It was about a wannabe Batlash-style card sharp who has a run-in with a Lee Van Cleef type who has a band of murderous outlaws planning a train robbery. If you say that doesn't sound like a typical Thor story, that's exactly why I liked it, as it had a bit of a Highlander vibe, but in the weird West. To say more would spoil it, but despite spending years in obscurity, it seems to have been reappraised and lauded in recent times. It added as a bonus story to the final Black Panther by Christopher Priest omnibus that sits on my bookshelf. I'm pretty sure that my brother bought the all-new, all-different Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man number 117. The cover featuring Black Cat battling Doctor Strange is very familiar. It was another missing in action tie-in with a blink and you'll miss it Sabretooth cameo. Also, the last page had a woman drinking coffee in the mountains near Spidey's shredded costume, unquestionably by a different art team than the main story, and that's a solid memory for me. However, the actual story by Rich Buckler and a young Dwayne Turner, wherein they give Black Panther her equivalent of Dinah's jazzercise outfit, drains all the energy out of me just by looking at it. I never read this thing. Weirdly, Louise Jones is credited as writing X Factor number 7, even though she was Simonson last issue, and Walt will be penciling the title in a few months. I bring this up mostly because the actual issue offers nothing of interest. This is the one with the big bald guy and the slug guy. Also, this was during the period where the team wore uniforms and pretended to be Ghostbusters but against mutants, while also wearing their X Factor costumes and supporting mutants. But both these groups have 5 members with distinct body types, only one girl who's a redhead on both teams, and one guy who wears red glasses per team. Who fell for this? Jimmy Olsen? I wasn't aware of the Bengals if she knew what she wants when it came out, but the Turner Broadcasting Station program Night Flight did a video retrospective on the band a few years later that I taped to VHS and still have a copy of. Their flame was far from eternal, but I really loved that band while it lasted, especially the tracks off Different Light, which my father eventually bought on CD and I dubbed it cassette. I'm not sure exactly when I first heard Sledgehammer by Peter Gabriel, but I figure it's a safe bet to be on NBC's Friday night videos, because the stop-motion animation visuals are inextricably linked to the song in my mind. My first impression of Peter Gabriel was not as the avant-garde former leader of Genesis, but as something of a novelty act, an impression which took a bit to shake. Bob Seger's Like a Rock was basically composed to be used in commercials, and I doubt I heard it on the radio in this time, but instead on ads for pickup trucks. Did you guys get those north of Mason-Dixon? I want to say it was specifically for Ford F-10s. I can't take that song seriously. It's forever a jingle to me. Those ads ran for years. I likely also caught Prince's Mountains on Friday night videos. I never thought much of it. Prince's outfit with the cropped dress top and the sombrero looked silly, and the superimposition of the band over natural wonders looked corny and cheap. I know this is an off-sided favorite of Prince fans, but it's a pass for me. I of course knew Phil Collins, but his band Genesis were unknown to me before the huge hit Invisible Touch, which just served to make Collins seem like a bigger deal than he already was solo. I vaguely recall reading an issue of Cracked at a bench near the apartment complex pool that summer, and I want to say that issue was making fun of Genesis while I was listening to them. Pet Shop Boys' Opportunities, Let's Make Lots of Money, was popular on Houston's 104 KRBE, the local top 40 station, in the late 80s, especially on Saturday nights when they specialized in dance tracks. I doubt I heard it before 1988 though. Well, that little consolidation kind of bit me on the boo-boo. I think all the second week books logically landed on May the 13th, and then I proceeded to buy nothing from May the 21st, so I have nada to talk about comic-wise. I do have a segment written up on 70s video games, but I think I'll save it for a 5-week month and just jumped into the movie segment. As I recall, Short Circuit was viewed on one of those 3-movie VHS EP dubs off cable TV. It still boggles my mind a bit to consider what a big star Steve Guttenberg became in the 1980s. All on the back of the truly dire Police Academy movies that I slopped up just like everyone else. Judge Reinhold has a look at his career and ask himself, why not me? And I'm going to say that he was too tall to be an everyman. Plus he was best known for playing against Eddie Murphy, and that's just not fair. Kerry Mahoney was the Axel Foley of the Police Academy movies, even as that's like saying that a McRib is the pork tenderloin of McDonald's. But that's still better than being the guy caught spanking it to Phoebe Cates by Phoebe Cates in the bathroom while dressed for his shift at a burger joint. Admittedly, especially in the 80s, it was probably worse getting busted for what they thought Kerry Mahoney had done to Commandant Lassard, but he bore that assumption without shame, and there was grace in that. Anyway, Steve Guttenberg played an everyman scientist working to build combat robots for the United States government. Yeah, I don't know how that's an everyman role, but this was perhaps Steve Guttenberg's essential talent. One of the robots, number 5, is struck by lightning and seemingly gains sentience as a result. The robot, not wanting to be part of the military-industrial complex or dissected, goes AWOL and ends up hiding out with Ali Sheedy from the Breakfast Club. Steve Guttenberg is trying to recover the robot with his fellow scientist, noted East Indian Fisher Stevens. You may be saying to yourself, hey me, I don't think Fisher Stevens is a typical Indian name. You must recall that this was the 80s, and just 6 years earlier, Peter Sellers' last film had him playing Fu Manchu. Slathering a white dude in brown makeup to go full Apu simply was not a concern in Reagan's America. And I was so ignorant that the surprise was when he was out of makeup. Regardless, it was a fun picture, and I saw the sequel in a theater. Speaking of the age of Ronnie, Alan Alda was one of the more out liberals of that period, and as such was often made a subject of ridicule. Not as bad as that granola-eating hippie Ed Begley Jr. got, with his ridiculous electric car, like anyone would ever want one of those. Since Alan Alda was framed as another bleeding heart liberal lame brain, and I lacked the political awareness and critical thinking to come to my own conclusions, I was fairly Alda-averse in this time period. But also, I'm just not very interested in the Revolutionary War period, and Alda as a college professor whose book on it is getting a butchered Hollywood adaptation wouldn't exactly ring my bell today. I didn't have much exposure to MASH until it went into syndication against the 10 o'clock news later in the decade. And obviously Hawkeye Pierce is one of the great TV characters. There's a lot of Alda in Hawkeye, but I didn't feel like there was enough Hawkeye and Alda in the context of Sweet Liberty, which I think was another cable dub. Michelle Pfeiffer was also in the flick, yet still somehow not enough to get me to more than a half-watch bits of it at one time. Missed me with that Top Gun. I don't remember the ads for it so much as the aftermath, like going to a jet show in Pasadena and having Kenny Loggins' Danger Zone blasting over the speakers. I'd seen Tom Cruise in a number of smaller parts by this point, like Taps, The Outsiders, and mostly Legend, but I don't think I fully recognized his existence yet. Obviously Top Gun was a huge hit with a large cultural impact, and my stepfather made it an early VHS rental once we got a VCR. I just thought the movie sucked. And I still think the movie sucks. There's been a whole reckoning with whether it's sucking is the consensus in the years since. Muddying the matter is the rare and enormous success of Maverick, the pandemic-era blockbuster that Spielberg claimed saved cinema. I was fine with missing Maverick at said cinema, but I was curious about the hype when it hit cable, and got sucked in. It's not that Maverick is some great classic, and it's not my usual fare, but I have to admit that it got the job done and definitely hit me in the old man feels at times. Also, I've been looking at Jennifer Connelly since Labyrinth, and it seems like I'll continue to appreciate looking at Jennifer Connelly for the rest of our lives. I wasn't immune to Cruise's coming omnipresence, as his star igniting opened the floodgates for all those films he'd done since 1981, hitting UHF fast and often. I'd have watched The Outsiders again anyway, that's a classic. Risky Business was probably another rental, but I was never that big on it past the Bob Seger dancing in underpants of it all. I was weirdly more interested in Losing It, a 60s sex comedy about a bunch of gringos trying to lose their virginity on a trip to Tijuana. It made 14% of its budget back at the box office, but I was a Porky's kid, and it seemed good-natured, where Risky Business was preoccupied with icy subway sex cool. Probably one of the many things wrong with me is I simply had too much childhood exposure to Klaus Kinski, though blessedly not as much as his poor daughters. Kinski was an extraordinary screen presence, by all accounts an absolutely despicable and dangerous human being. By this point I'd seen him in Nosferatu the Vampire, Schizoid, and Android, all of which he'd made an impression within. Mostly that was the volatile Kinski himself, but the extremes of horror and science fiction in those movies surely had an influence. Crawlspace was about the disgraced physician's son of a Nazi Joseph Mengele type who takes to imprisoning and dismembering young women. That's a pretty intense angle, and that tension is also present on the set, to such a degree that the director has stated a producer seriously discussed having Kinski murdered for the insurance money rather than continuing the shoot. Gee, I wonder why Empire Pictures folded. I just told you that I was a weird kid. So one of the few Sylvester Stallone vehicles that I gravitated toward was Cobra. This was another cable dub loner, and I think I even vaguely recall the HBO ad bumpers for cable coming on before the movie. Sly plays Lieutenant Marion Cobretti, renegade cop who throws out the rule book, yada yada. In case it wasn't Dirty Harry enough for you, they even hire the actor who played the killer from Dirty Harry to portray the City Hall suit that Cobra argues the finer points of the law with. Cobra has to protect a murder witness played by his then wife, Brigitte Nielsen, who is being hunted by an entire cult of serial killer bikers. Brian Thompson is one of the heaviest heavies who ever heavied, and he's at his heaviest here. The final showdown has him in a smelting plant, dripping sweat, fetishistically squeezing the handle of his custom hybrid Bowie knife spiked brass knuckle killamajig, repeatedly spit talking to Cobra's face in his deepest baritone about what a pig he is. Everything in this movie is so much. Like the way the camera lingers on the King Cobra on the hilt of his gun as he twirls and holsters it, how the cult all gather for a TED Talk on murdering while waving their axes in the air like foam fingers, and how a cop gets to drive around in a souped up 1950 Mercury with awesome 50 license plates that is pure automotive ecstasy. This movie was just so vivid to me. Plus it had whichever issue of Mad or Cracked parodied it. Weirdly, this all spun out of Stallone having been cast in Beverly Hills Cop and then walking away. And then Brigitte Nielsen ends up being the villain in its sequel. Small world, I guess. I tend to think of Cobra being a failure because it didn't get a sequel and hardly anybody seems to talk about it. But it made 6.5 times its budget, so it was no slouch. I think I caught Jake's Speed on TV, but I doubt I'd have finished it there. So maybe it was a bad dollar show. It's a takeoff on men's adventure novels like the Mac Bolan series, but more tongue-in-cheek. John Hurt is the villain. I'm confident that I saw Poltergeist 2 The Other Side much earlier and more often than the original, thanks to a cable dub. As a result, I prefer its darker tone. And also it's the one where Coach drinks the mezcal worm, and that stuck with me. Plus it has the crazy, creepy evangelical preacher who delivers some momentous sermons, and is one of the banes of my buddy Mac's childhood.
Sitting in the movie show, thinking nasty thoughts. I better be a gentleman or you turn me off. That's right, let me tell it, nasty boys, I don't mean anything. Oh, you nasty boys, nasty boys, I don't ever change. Oh, you nasty boys.
I don't know if I ever bought the 2-issue double-link Lois Lane miniseries by Mindy Newell and Gray Morrow. I just know they had haunted the Quarter Bennett Marauder books in 1989, and that wasn't the only shop I could say that about. Even if I did finally pick it up to own, I've never read it. And hey, while I'm shouting out Marauder's clearance bins, let me also mention other frequent detritus like Independent Comics' The Epsilon Wave, Mr. Monster's High Octane Horror number 1, which I did buy, Nervous Rex series, Blackthorn, various issues of Eclipse's The New Wave, Blackthorn's Preteen Dirty Jean Kung Fu Kangaroos number 1 only, Elite Sea Dragon series, Aircell Stark Future number 1, and Ocean Comics Street Master, various issues. I often use the Champions role-playing game as a shorthand for uninspired, plainly derivative, fanish junk characters and pedestrian stories by anonymous journeymen and never-wases. This is in part because I fished Eclipse's adaptation, Champions number 1, out of these bins, and it was the platonic ideal of basicness. It made the new universe look like Watchmen by comparison. Little Bro might have had a copy of Star Comics' Masters of the Universe number 3. He definitely had figures of Orko, Battlecat, Prince Adam, and probably the cover featured Slime Pit. He was a prolific collector, who owned most of the 1985 and 1986 figures. Just at a glance, I recognize Moss Man, a repurposed Beastman, Roboto with the transparent chest to let you see his gears, Cyclone, Too Bad with 2 heads and a pair of action-swinging arms, Stinkor, Spikor, Leech with the suction cups, Mantenna with the bug-out eye stalks, Modulok with 2 heads and 6 insect legs, Extendar with techno-expanding neck and appendages, Rio Blast, who looked like a redneck crossover with the Cops line, King Hiss, who was made out of snakes inside of a removable human suit, and some of the stupid Transformer guys that turn into rocks. He also had a number of vehicles, but I didn't care as much about those. Battlebone sticks out though, because it was a dinosaur skeleton with hooped rings that doubled as a carrier for a bunch of figures. We both had color variations on Hordak and Grizzlor. Mine was the lighter brown fur and his near black. The Horde Trooper was featured in this comic, and at first I thought he had one, but now that I look, I'm not so sure. All this is to say that the comic book looked like kid stuff, so I skipped reading it. If there's one thing I'd rather not have to write up twice in 1 month, it's Son of Ambush Bug. And yet here we're back for more or less a third helping. I do have angles though. DC Comics fans talk a lot about the impact of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and particulars like how Roy Thomas got hosed by losing access to the Golden Age heroes amidst the obliteration of Earth 2 from continuity. But what about Julius Schwartz? After Mort Weisinger lost his editorship over Superman, his life spiraled, and he was destitute when he died. Nothing so dramatic happened with Julie, but after the line of DC science fiction graphic novel adaptations floundered in 1985, and with the massive editorial overhauls of 1986, Schwartz was more or less shown the door. He would continue as a sort of goodwill ambassador for DC Comics along the lines of a Stan Lee, with some sort of stipend involved, but as a powerful figure, the man was done. And in this very issue of Ambush Bug was an ad for the Man of Steel miniseries, with Andrew Helfer as the new overseer of the Superman line, and John Byrne as the primary creative force who was intentionally erasing much of the body of work Schwartz had commissioned for that character since the 1960s. It's hard not to see the largely plotless excesses of Son of Ambush Bug as a sort of primal scream of rage and a quiet whimper of futility at the injustice of its creative team's straits. Everyone involved was losing their DC, and probably their financial welfare, and also having their memories and legacies scrubbed before their eyes. The book goes to dark places, as when a secret government operation tries to use the Ambush Bug suits left on his mini corpses to develop agents who could teleport, only to learn the suits were literally devouring their wearers. Or how the tossed-off gag of an Ambush Bug-fronted super team from the first miniseries was now seeing its underdeveloped membership committing suicide. And that's before they do a terrible running joke about iguanas tied into the bombing of Hiroshima. But again, I found this madness engrossing. Trying to figure out mysteries of what I'd missed that were never meant to even be considered, much less solved. In retrospect, everyone was just filling pages, and there's a genuine underlying anger to the anti-humor. I've heard that Giffen would often just draw random things and hand off the pages to scripter Robert Loren Fleming to figure out what to do with, not offering any notes or suggestions. I didn't think that's why this miniseries is amused with itself, but not actually directing any sincere humor toward an audience. It's all a hostile meta in-joke, with the embodiment of capricious editorial fiat in the cosmic villain the Interferer, turning the creatives into his whipping boys. And yet I adore the art, constant breaking of the fourth wall, the jokes lobbed by and against the various named members of the creative team. Schwartz is clearly absentee, but he gets his turn. For instance, the issue is sandwiched between splash pages of a barely clothed airhead bimbo who hosts the comic, and in the end is left in the clutches of Schwartz, which reads a lot different after Colleen Durand's accusations that Schwartz was a sex pest. I have no doubt that Giffen's jab at Jules was affectionate, but even here, that undercurrent. Web of Spider-Man number 18 was, I think, the last part of Missing in Action, and it is about how anyone who thought that scraps of Spidey's costume lying around after a battle meant that he was dead was a dummy. Like, Webhead pioneered torn costumes. So he was running around, beat up and half naked, doing a reenactment of a Macon County Line or Born Innocent type movie. One of those ones where regular folk are railroaded into prison by crooked southern authorities. Anyway, Peter eventually got loose and hitchhiked home. There's also a teaser for the arrival of Venom. This was another of my bros books. Easily the most interesting thing was Kyle Baker inking Mark Silvestri. West Coast Avengers number 12 was, I think, another Brochus, which I recall mostly for the debut of Wonder Man's red and green costume, which I still think is among the most hideous suits ever worn by a mainstream hero. I think Jose Luis Garcia Lopez drew it for Ohatmu, and if he couldn't salvage it, nobody could. Speaking of Ohatmu, there's a trio of new villains introduced, and Zax, with 3 Z's, will perpetually be the last entry in future volumes. Quantum was trying to compete with Wonder Man's Couture, so the only one to catch my eye was Half-Life, a blue-skinned zombie hooker almost certainly inspired by Linnea Quigley's character from Return of the Living Dead. The final splash features Graviton, who I took to be a low-rent Magneto, and have yet to be disabused of that notion in 38 years. The blue and white suit looks good though.
'Cause I wanna be good for you. I didn't mean to be bad. But darling, I'm still the best that you ever had. Just give me a chance to let me show you how much I wanna give you my love touch. I wanna give you my love touch.
I spent so much of last month shrugging and saying nothing happened. May 1st, the Chernobyl nuclear plant melted down. In the United States, we'd had the 3 Mile Island incident in 1979, and the world had lived under the specter of the bomb throughout the Cold War. This, though, was among our worst fears manifested. Government incompetence and malfeasance. Mass deaths. Some immediate, others agonizingly protracted. A huge area rendered uninhabitable by humans for centuries. This was on the news every night for weeks, with Peter Jennings gaslighting me to think the capital was pronounced Moscow, until I finally checked on the internet. Also, the found footage horror movie The Chernobyl Diaries, which really stank. Don't bother with that. Hands Across America took place on Sunday, May 25th. As I understand it, the usual braying nationalistic morons were upset over USA for Africa organizing an historic event for famine relief in Ethiopia when there are hungry people in America. I don't dispute that. I have been one of those. But also, our hunger was caused by capitalist greed that deprives our citizens of basic necessities to incentivize workers to toil for as little money as possible to make their ends meet in the name of maximizing profits. We could feed every person in this country if not for, the abject evil of our anti-Christian money grubbing. But hey, benefits were hot, so let's do a benefit. This time, the idea was to charge people $10 a head to stand outside for hours in the summer sun, holding some stranger's sweaty paws to make a public spectacle of themselves. There was a route laid out that would have bisected the United States, but surprise, most of the action was in heavily populated cities. The real America, the places where the fewest Americans actually live, the supposed moral center of the universe, failed to show up. There were attempts to bus city folk to the boonies to fill the gaps, but not much interest in wasting people's time in service to an ill-considered publicity stunt. It might have helped if they'd also gotten an all-star lineup of musical artists to drop a single. The main way Do They Know It's Christmas and We Are the World made their money, but these chuckleheads opted for session players and members of Toto singing a tepid chorus. The song peaked at 65. The charity spent far more than they actually made for the hungry, and the artist currently known as Prince bought the first mile's worth of empty space. And in my case, personally, Houston was too far south, so they opted for Dallas, which I wouldn't pass through until the following year. And on top of it all, the former president of Argentina was sentenced to 12 years for bungling the Falklands War, and Somali Civil War started, but neither were on my radar.
See that man over there? He's my brother. And when he laughs, I laugh. And when he cries, I cry. And when he needs me, I'll be right there by his side. Hands across America. Hands across this land I love. Divided we fall, united we stand. Hands across America.
Folks who want to see our resume include Billy Hines on My Way to Bluer Skies, who added, I really enjoy these little audio blog podcasts Frank does. Well produced and researched little time capsules. That G.I. Joe number 41 I read in Action Force Weekly. The attack on Springfield issue with those first pages that split the Joes into different teams impacted how I played. The stealth team with Snake Eyes, Spirit, etc. seemed so cool to young me. And Comics Serpentor didn't offend me. Well, if you've listened to this episode, you know I approached the Springfield issue. Also, I picked up a bunch of Action Comics weeklies for like $1 a piece in Chicago when I was there last year. Not that I had a burning need to own them, but I don't think that they were being treated well by the person who had them, and I've made a point of getting them a nice new bags and boards. Someday I'll have to find a good home for them. Carrying on, there's Bob at Megathumbzilla, Brew Sleep, Chris at Bad Books for Beginners, Chris Dunford, Chris Lydon, The Comic Crush, Dave's Comic Heroes blog, DC Dave, Del Dracula, Derek WC, Dr. Pop Culture, Ed Moore, at Teal Productions, Illegal Machine, I Was Joe Was, The Irredeemable Shag, JMT Productions, Julia Raul, Kailash Jwalamuki, writer and media in charge, Keith G. Baker, Lucretia Garcia, Maxo, Micah Send Aliens to Me, Miracle Man aka Old Man Kimoda, Petrus Gaspard, Pop Culture Affidavit, Satin Tights Wonder Woman Podcast, Scott X, Siskoid, Stop Let's Team Up, a comic podcast, Superbound, and Thirsty's New and Used.
Searching my mind for some truths to reveal. What thoughts are fantasy? What memories?